The tiny gray kitten hadn't made a sound, not a single meow for 3 days. Not since the afternoon the cardboard box came, and his brother was taken away. He just sat there, now on the cold, dusty floorboards of the spare room, a room that was too big, too quiet, without the pitter-patter of another set of paws. Leo was his name. At least that's the name the woman Mara had whispered to him the first night he'd arrived. A scared, fluffy pair with his littermate Sam. Leo and Sam. It had a rhythm to it, a completeness. Now it was just Leo. And the name felt like a hole in the air. Mara stood in the doorway, her shoulder leaning against the frame, her arms crossed tight over her chest. She wasn't sure why she did that, held herself like that. Maybe to keep the emptiness of the apartment from seeping in. It was a habit she'd picked up in the 6 months since the divorce papers were signed. A way of making herself physically smaller in a space that suddenly felt vast and echoing. The late afternoon light, the kind that's thick and heavy with dust, cut a weak orange line across the floor, stopping just short of Leo's paws. He was tucked into the shadow, a little gray statue facing the corner where the two of them, he and Sam, used to pile into an old sweater to sleep. She could still smell the rain from that day. It was the main thing she remembered. A cold, late autumn rain that smelled of wet pavement and decaying leaves. The man who took Sam had been nice, his voice gentle. He'd asked all the right questions, showed pictures of his sunny living room, promised a life of cat trees and window perches. A good home, a better home, he'd said for one of them. The rescue organization had insisted Mara, a first-time foster, only keep one. It's easier, the coordinator had said brightly over the phone. Less hassle. You can really focus on socializing him before he gets adopted. Mara had agreed. It made logical sense, but logic has a way of evaporating in the face of a silent, grieving kitten. She watched him. His entire world had shrunk down to this 1 square foot of floorboard. His fur, a soft gray like chimney smoke, was fluffed up against the chill she couldn't really feel. His ears, too big for his head, were pinned back, not in fear, but in a profound, weary sadness. And his eyes were what broke her. They were the color of a winter ocean, a deep, changeable blue-green, and they were fixed on that empty corner, unblinking. He wasn't sleeping. He was just gone, somewhere inside himself, in a place where his brother still was. Mara's own breath felt shallow in her chest. She knew that feeling. The feeling of being anchorless, of looking at the space on the couch where someone used to sit and feeling the shape of their absence more strongly than you ever felt their presence. She'd spent weeks doing the same thing Leo was doing now, staring at walls, at ceilings, waiting for the world to make a sound that made sense again. She took a slow step into the room, the old floorboard creaking under her weight. Leo didn't startle. He didn't even flick an ear. It was like he'd retreated so far into his own hurt that the outside world had just stopped existing. "Hey, little man," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. She hadn't really spoken to anyone all day. The sound of it was strange in the quiet room. Nothing. She lowered herself to the floor, crossing her legs, keeping her distance. She didn't want to crowd him. The chill of the wood seeped through her jeans. She could see the fine layer of dust that had settled over everything, including the baseboard behind him. This room was supposed to be her art studio. The New Start room. Instead, the canvases stood blank and accusing in the corner, and the only thing inhabiting the space was a profound shared sorrow. She remembered the noise they used to make. Leo and Sam, a tiny rumbling duo of purrs. They'd climb into her lap while she sat on the couch watching TV, a double dose of warmth and vibrating fur. They'd chase each other's tails under the kitchen table, a blur of gray and white, a tiny cyclone of joy. Sam was the bold one, the first to explore, the first to bat at a string. Leo was always watching, always just half a step behind, taking his cues from his brother. His courage was a shared thing, borrowed. And now the bank was closed. The sunbeam creeping across the floor began to fade, the orange light softening into a dull gray. Dusk was coming on. The room grew colder. Mara shivered, but she didn't move. She just watched the tiny, silent rise and fall of Leo's ribs. He was breathing so softly. She found herself matching her breath to his, a slow, sad rhythm in the growing dark. She thought about the coordinator's words. You can really focus on socializing him. How do you socialize a creature that has decided the world is no longer a place worth engaging with? How do you teach trust when the fundamental truth of their existence has been shattered? It felt like a cruel joke. She was supposed to prepare him for a new family, to make him bright and adoptable, when all she wanted to do was sit on this cold floor with him and mourn. A car alarm wailed somewhere down on the street, a distant, frantic sound. For the first time, Leo moved. Not much, just the very tip of his tail. A tiny involuntary twitch, then stillness again. It was something. Mara leaned forward just a little. "He's okay, you know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was talking to the kitten, but maybe she was talking to herself too. "The man, he seemed really nice." "He had a kind face. He's probably got a big fluffy bed for him by now. He's probably not cold." Leo's head moved, a fraction of an inch. One of his ears swiveled, just for a second, in her direction. He was listening, or maybe he was just reacting to the sound of her voice, a disturbance in the silence he had cultivated. It was enough to give her a sliver of hope, a tiny fragile thing. She didn't know what to do next. The guidebooks, the foster packets, they didn't have a chapter on this. They talked about syringe feeding, about flea baths, about litter box training. They didn't talk about the silence that follows loss. They didn't talk about how to mend a broken heart the size of a walnut. So she just stayed. She sat on the cold floor as the room was swallowed by the deep blue of early evening. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. She watched the small, lonely shape of the kitten. She felt the familiar ache of her own loneliness, a cold stone in her gut, and in that quiet, dark room a connection began to form. Not a happy one, not a joyful one, but a real one. A thread, thin as spider silk, spun from shared sorrow. She didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. The quiet, aching prelude to everything that was going to happen next. The thing he would do, the thing that would change both of their lives forever, was still waiting in the darkness hours away. You're here, listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The days that followed were quiet. They weren't the heavy, suffocating quiet of those first 3 days, but a different kind. A waiting kind of quiet, the kind that hangs in the air just before a rainstorm, thick with unspoken things. Mara found herself moving through her apartment with a new awareness, a hypersensitivity to the smallest of sounds. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of a pipe in the wall, the soft, almost imperceptible sound of a tiny gray kitten breathing. She kept the door to the spare room open. It felt wrong to close it, like she'd be shutting him away with his grief. So it stayed open, a dark, rectangular mouth leading into the heart of the silence, and she'd find herself pausing in the hallway, her hands full of laundry or a cup of tea, just to look in. He was always in the same spot, a little gray sentinel facing the corner, but slowly, so slowly it was almost like watching a shadow move across the floor. Things began to shift. It started on the 4th day. Mara came home from her shift at the diner, her shoes damp from the sleet outside, her shoulders aching with the kind of tired that comes from smiling too much. The apartment was dark and cold. She flicked on the lights, shrugged off her coat, and her eyes went immediately to the spare room doorway. He was there. Of course he was there. But this time his head was turned. Just slightly. His ears were perked, swiveled toward the sound of her coming in. He was listening. Her heart did a funny little stutter in her chest. It was nothing, probably. Just a reflex, but it felt like something. It felt like a thread. That single spider silk thread she'd felt in the dark had just gotten a tiny bit stronger. She didn't go to him. She went to the kitchen instead, her movement slow and deliberate. She filled the kettle, clicked on the stove, the normal sounds of home. She opened a can of soup, the metallic screech rip echoing in the quiet. She peeked around the corner. He hadn't moved, but his posture was different. Less hunched, more alert. His food and water bowls were in the spare room, untouched. She'd been changing the water daily, scooping out the dry food that remained uneaten. It was a small daily heartache. But that night after her soup, she did something different. She opened a new can of the wet food, the really smelly kind the rescue coordinator had given her for emergencies. The rich, pâté-like smell of chicken and liver flooded the kitchen. She spooned a small amount into a clean bowl. Instead of taking it to a spot in the spare room, she set it down on the floor just outside the doorway, right on the line where the hardwood of the hallway met the old carpet of the spare room. A boundary. She placed it carefully, then took 3 steps back and sat down on the floor herself, her back against the opposite wall of the hallway. She pulled her knees up to her chest and waited. The apartment was silent except for the ticking of the clock in the living room and the low rumble of the kettle coming to a boil. She could see him from her spot on the floor. He had turned his whole body now, away from the corner toward the doorway, toward the smell. His nose was twitching, a tiny frantic movement. She could see the internal war playing out on his small face, the deep primal urge for food warring with the profound soul-deep fear of everything beyond his sad little square of carpet. He took 1 step, then another. His movements were hesitant, each paw placed with excruciating care as if the floor itself might be a trap. He stopped at the threshold. He stretched his neck out, his small black nose quivering, sniffing the air just above the bowl. He was so close. He looked from the food to her, back to the food. His winter ocean eyes were wide, not with trust but with a calculated risk assessment. And then he did it. He darted forward, grabbed a single, frantic mouthful of the food, and scrambled backward so fast he almost tripped over his own feet. He retreated to the safety of his corner and swallowed the bite, his body tense, his eyes fixed on her, waiting for the trick, the punishment, the catch. Mara didn't move. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She just sat, her own breath held. It was a victory. A tiny stolen victory, a mouthful of food, but it felt like a mountain had been moved. The next day, she did the same thing. This time he was already watching from the doorway when she set the bowl down. He waited a few minutes after she sat down, then crept forward. This time he took 2 bites before retreating. On the 3rd day it was raining again, a steady gray drizzle that blurred the windows. Mara sat on the floor, her back against the wall, a book open in her lap. She wasn't really reading. She'd placed the bowl. He came forward less hesitant this time. He ate 3 bites. Then, instead of immediately running, he paused. He lifted his head, a tiny bit of food on his whiskers, and he looked at her. Really looked at her. Not a glance, not a fearful assessment, a look. His eyes held hers for a full 3 seconds. And then he did the most astonishing thing. He blinked. It was a slow, deliberate blink. His eyes closed and then opened again, slowly, peacefully. In the language of cats, it was everything. It was a gesture of trust, of non-aggression. It was like a hand offered in a quiet room. Mara felt a lump form in her throat, so sudden and so large she couldn't have spoken even if she'd known what to say. She was afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Slowly, carefully, she gave the blink back. She closed her eyes, held them closed for a moment, and opened them. He was still looking at her. He gave another slow blink, and then, as if that was all the conversation he could manage for one day, he turned and walked, not ran, back to his corner. Mara sat there for a long time after, the rain pattering against the window, the heat kicking on with a soft groan. The hallway floor was cold and hard against her legs, but she didn't care. She felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the furnace. It was the warmth of being seen, of being acknowledged. It was the first genuine connection she'd felt with another living thing in months. Have you ever had an animal look at you like that? Not for food, not for a door to be opened, but just to see you, to say in their own quiet way, I am here and you are there and that is okay. The following week was a dance of tiny steps forward and half steps back. Some days he'd eat all his food from the bowl in the hallway. Other days he'd only take a bite or 2. He began to explore a little. Mara would find him sometimes in the very center of the spare room, instead of pressed into the corner. Once she came out of the bathroom and saw a flash of gray tail disappearing back into the room. He'd been investigating the hallway. She started talking to him. Not baby talk, not a stream of constant chatter, but just narrating her life in a low, calm voice. It's supposed to get cold tonight, Leo, really cold, she'd say, standing at the window. She'd see one of his ears twitch from the other room. I burned the toast again. Smells awful, doesn't it? A pause. She liked to imagine he was agreeing with her. She bought him a small stuffed mouse, one with a little bell inside it. She placed it in the middle of the spare room floor one morning before work. When she came home, it was gone. Her heart sank for a second, thinking he'd hated it, batted it under the dresser. But then she saw it. He had carefully, meticulously moved it. It was now sitting neatly in the center of his sweater bed, placed there with purpose. It was his. He had accepted it. The real turning point came on a Tuesday. Mara had had a bad day, a truly spectacularly awful day. A customer had screamed at her over a misplaced order. Her car had a flat tire she couldn't afford to fix, and the rain had found its way through the sole of her only good pair of boots. She came home soaked, shivering, and feeling that old familiar emptiness yawn wide open inside her. The kind of emptiness that whispered that she was alone, that she'd always be alone, that her life was just a series of damp bus stops and cold apartments. She didn't even bother with the lights. She kicked off her wet boots, left her coat in a pile by the door, and just walked into the living room and sank onto the couch. She put her face in her hands and just let the weight of it all press down on her. She didn't cry. She was too tired for tears. She just sat there in the dark, listening to the sound of her own ragged breathing. She didn't know how long she sat like that. Long enough for the room to get completely dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, painting silver stripes on the floor. Long enough for her legs to go numb. She was so deep inside her own hurt that she almost didn't register the new sound. It was a soft, shuffling sound, a whisper of movement on the carpet. She slowly lifted her head, and there he was. Leo was standing at the very edge of the living room carpet. He was just a silhouette in the dim light, but she could see the outline of his ears, the curve of his tail. He was watching her. He took one tentative step into the room, then another. He was out of his spare room. He had crossed the boundary of the hallway on his own. Mara held her breath. She didn't move a muscle. He walked slowly, with a quiet dignity, across the living room floor. He didn't come directly to her. He stopped first to sniff the leg of the coffee table, then a stray magazine on the floor. He was mapping this new territory, making sure it was safe. His journey seemed to take forever, a slow, meandering path that brought him eventually to the foot of the couch. He stopped there. He looked up at her, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. She could hear the soft sound of his purr for the first time in over a week. It was a low, rusty sound, like an engine trying to turn over after a long winter. And then he jumped. Not onto the couch beside her, not onto her lap. He jumped onto the cushion next to her hip, but he kept a careful few inches of space between them. He curled into a tight, neat circle, tucking his paws under his chest. He was a compact little sphere of gray fur, and he was purring that rusty, hesitant purr. He was near her. Not touching, but near he had come to her. On the worst day, in the deepest dark, he had left the safety of his grief-filled corner, crossed the unknown territory of the apartment, and had chosen to be near her. Mara felt the tears come then. Not the hard, angry tears from before. These were soft, quiet, healing tears. They rolled down her cheeks without a sound. She so slowly lifted her hand. She didn't reach for him. She just laid her hand on the couch cushion, palm up in the space between them. An invitation. A question. He watched her hand for a long moment. His purr stuttered, then resumed, a little stronger this time. He uncurled himself just a little. He stretched his head forward, his nose twitching. He sniffed her fingertips. His breath was warm and soft on her skin. And then he did it. He broke the distance. He pressed the top of his head, the space between his ears, firmly into the center of her palm. It was a single, unmistakable gesture, a head bunt, a cat's kiss. It was the lightest of touches, but Mara felt it reverberate through her entire body, shaking something loose inside her chest, something that had been frozen and cold for a very long time. He held it there for a second, 2 seconds, pouring the vibration of his purr into her hand, and then, as if the effort had used up all his courage, he retreated, curling back into his ball, closing his eyes. But he didn't leave. He stayed on the cushion, purring, his body a warm, living presence beside her in the dark. Mara left her hand there, palm up, feeling the ghost of his touch. The emptiness inside her was still there, but it didn't feel quite so empty anymore. It felt quiet, peaceful, like a room after a storm has passed. She looked at the small, sleeping form beside her, and for the first time she understood. This wasn't just about her helping him. This was about them helping each other. Do you think they know? Do you think they can somehow sense the cracks in us, the broken places, and decide, against all their own instincts, to step right in and just sit with us in the dark? She didn't know the answer, but as she sat there in the quiet, listening to the soft rhythm of his purr and the gentle tap of rain against the window, she knew one thing for certain. Something had begun. Not just his healing, theirs. The head bunt changed everything. It was like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. It didn't suddenly make Leo a bold, outgoing cat. He was still himself, quiet, observant, prone to moments of sudden skittishness where he'd vanish under the bed for an hour. But the dam had broken. The silent, suffocating grief that had filled the apartment began to slowly drain away, replaced by something new, a tentative rhythm, a shared language. He started sleeping on the couch. Not with her, not yet, but on the couch. He claimed the far end, the corner cushion that was always a little lumpy. Mara would wake up in the morning, and her first conscious thought would be to look over at that cushion. And there he'd be, a neat little loaf, his tail tucked tightly around his paws, his winter ocean eyes open, just watching her, as if he'd been keeping watch all night. The rituals began. Every morning she'd shuffle to the kitchen, her eyes still blurry with sleep, and he would follow. Not at her heels, but with a careful, measured distance, hopping onto the kitchen counter to sit regally by the sink while she made coffee. He'd watch the water drip through the machine with an intense fascination, his head tilting with each glug. She started talking to him more. Her morning monologues about the weather, the dreams she'd had, the errands she needed to run. He'd listen, his ears swiveling, and sometimes he'd offer a slow blink in return, which felt like a quiet, "I know. Me too." The world outside the windows grew colder, hardening into the deep, brittle heart of winter. Frost etched intricate frozen ferns on the glass each morning. The wind whistled a low, lonely tune through the gaps in the old window frames. Inside, though, the apartment began to feel warmer. The heat was still inconsistent, the radiators clanging and hissing their protests, but a new kind of warmth had taken root. It was the warmth of companionship, the profound comfort of another heartbeat in the room. Mara found herself looking forward to coming home. The dread that used to pool in her stomach when she turned her key in the lock was gone. Now there was a flicker of anticipation. Would he be waiting by the door? Sometimes he was, sitting primly on the mat, as if he'd been calculating the exact time of her return. Other times he'd be napping on his couch cushion, and he'd lift his head, yawn a tiny pink yawn, and stretch, acknowledging her arrival with a quiet dignity. It was enough. It was more than enough. She learned the map of his trust. He liked to be scratched right at the base of his tail, but only for 3 precise strokes. Any more and he'd gently move away. He loved the crinkly sound of the treat bag, but he wouldn't take them from her hand. She had to toss them a few feet away, and he'd pounce on them like the kitten he still was. He was fascinated by the flickering images of the television, especially nature documentaries with birds, his head tracking their movement across the screen, a low, chattering sound clicking in the back of his throat. It was good. It was so good. And that's why the first time it happened, it felt like a small, cold needle pricking the beautiful bubble they had built. It was a Thursday evening. Mara was curled on her end of the couch, Leo on his. She was reading a book and he was fast asleep, his paws twitching as he chased some dream prey. The wind was particularly fierce, rattling the window pane in its frame. Suddenly, Leo jerked awake. Not a slow, groggy waking, a full-body jolt, his head snapping up, his ears pivoting toward the window. His eyes were wide, not with curiosity, but with a sharp, focused intensity she hadn't seen since those first silent days. He looked at the window, then at her. And then he did something strange. He hopped off the couch, trotted to the center of the living room rug, and sat down. He began to groom himself with an abrupt, frantic energy, licking his paw and swiping it over his face again and again, as if trying to wash something away. It was a normal cat behavior, but the context was all wrong. It was too sudden, too agitated. Mara watched him, her book forgotten in her lap. "You okay, little man?" she murmured. He ignored her, finishing his frantic grooming with a violent shake of his whole body. Then he walked with a strange sense of purpose, not to the kitchen or back to the couch, but to the hallway that led to the spare room. He paused at the threshold, looked back at her one more time, and then disappeared into the darkness. Mara felt a tiny knot of worry tighten in her stomach. It was probably nothing. The wind had spooked him. He'd probably just gone to his safe spot under the bed. She tried to go back to her book, but the words had lost their meaning. She listened, but all she could hear was the wind. After about 10 minutes, she heard the soft pad of his paws returning. He came back into the living room, jumped onto his cushion, curled up, and went back to sleep as if nothing had happened. Mara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She wrote it off as a weird cat moment. They were full of those. But then it happened again 2 days later. And again. It became a pattern, always in the evening. always preceded by a sound: the slam of a car door downstairs, the wail of a distant siren, the shriek of the tea kettle. A sound would startle him from his doze, his head would snap up. That intense, almost haunted look would return to his eyes, and he would launch into that same ritual: the frantic grooming, the purposeful walk to the spare room, a disappearance for 5 or 10 minutes, and then a return to normalcy. It was the spare room that got to her. He never spent time in there anymore. His food and water were in the kitchen now. His toys were scattered around the living room. The spare room was once again just a storage space, a place of dust and shadows. Why did he keep going back there? The worry began to grow, a low-grade hum of anxiety beneath the surface of their peaceful days. Was he sick? Was something in that room hurting him? She started going in there when he was napping in the living room, looking for, she didn't know what. Signs of mice, a draft? She found nothing but dust bunnies and the lingering sadness of the room's history. One night, the ritual was different. It wasn't a sound that triggered him. Mara was on the floor playing with him with a feather wand, and he was actually playing, leaping and pouncing with a clumsy, joyful abandon that made her laugh out loud. It was the best moment they'd ever had. And then mid-pounce, he just stopped. He froze, his body low to the ground, his eyes fixed on nothing. The feather wavered in the air and settled on the carpet. He didn't groom himself this time. He just turned and walked with that same unnerving purpose straight to the spare room. This time, however, he didn't vanish completely. He stopped in the doorway, silhouetted by the light from the hallway. He looked back at her, and he meowed. It was the first sound he'd made since his brother left. It wasn't a cry of pain or fear. It was a small, questioning sound, a plea. It was so quiet, so fragile, it seemed to hang in the air between them. Then he disappeared into the dark. Mara's heart was hammering against her ribs. This was more than a weird habit. This felt intentional. This felt like he was trying to show her something. The fear of losing this fragile, beautiful connection they'd built was suddenly a cold stone in her gut. What if he was relapsing? What if the grief was pulling him back under for good? What if he was trying to tell her he was hurt, and she was too stupid to understand? She waited for him to return. The minutes stretched, 5, 10, he didn't come back. The apartment felt huge and silent again, the only sound the frantic beating of her own heart. The warmth they had built felt thin, fragile, threatened by the darkness of that one room. She couldn't stand it anymore. She had to know. Pushing herself up from the floor, her legs feeling weak and shaky, she walked to the hallway. The doorway to the spare room was a black rectangle. It felt like looking into the past, into all the loneliness she thought they'd left behind. "Leo?" she called softly, her voice trembling. No sound. She took a step into the room. The air was colder here, still and dusty. Her eyes strained to adjust to the gloom. She could make out the shape of the dresser, the blank canvases leaning against the wall. And then she saw him. He wasn't under the bed. He was in the far corner. His corner. The corner where he'd sat for 3 days without moving. He was sitting up, alert, and he was not alone. Lying on the floor in front of him, arranged with a care that was unmistakable, was a small, neat pile of objects. From her distance, in the poor light, she couldn't make out what they were. They were just dark shapes against the darker carpet. But he was sitting beside them, guarding them. As she took another step closer, he looked up at her. His eyes caught the faint light from the hall, glowing like twin moons. And he let out another soft, questioning meow. This is what he'd been doing. Every time. He'd been coming in here, to this. Mara's breath caught in her throat. She felt a prickle of tears, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming, terrifying wave of love and confusion. What was this? What had he been hiding? What had he been trying to show her? She took the final few steps into the room, her socks whispering on the carpet. She knelt down, her knees cracking in the silence, and she reached out a hand not to him, but to the small, mysterious collection he had so carefully gathered. Her fingers touched something soft, and something cold, and something sharp. Her heart stopped, because she knew, even before her eyes could fully see them in the dim light, what they were. They were his treasures. They were gifts. Her fingers, trembling and cold, hovered over the small secret pile. The dim light from the hallway bled into the room, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to breathe with her. It was a collection, not a random assortment of junk, but a curated, deliberate assembly. Each item was placed with care, not piled, but arranged side by side as if for display. For her, the first thing her fingertips brushed was the soft, worn felt of the tiny stuffed mouse she'd bought him, the one with the bell. He hadn't lost it or batted it away. He had brought it here, to this sacred sad corner. It was the centerpiece of his collection. Next to it was something cold and smooth, a bottle cap. She recognized it instantly. It was from the ginger ale she'd been drinking the night she'd sat on the floor with him, the night of the first head bunt. She'd left it on the coffee table. He must have nudged it off, batted it all the way across the living room, down the hall, and into this corner. Beside the bottle cap was a long, sturdy pine needle, the kind that fell from the wreath on her front door. It was perfectly intact, then a twist tie from a loaf of bread, a faded blue elastic hair tie she'd been looking for weeks, a single brown oak leaf crisp and veined that must have hitchhiked in on her shoe, and finally a jagged, beautiful shard of sea glass, frosted white by the waves. She knew this one too. She kept it in a small bowl on her dresser, a souvenir from a beach trip from a lifetime ago when things were happier. He must have jumped up there, a place she'd never seen him go, and carefully selected it. This was what he had been doing. All those times he'd been startled from his sleep, all those purposeful walks to this room. He wasn't reliving his grief. He wasn't scared or sick. He was building. He was gathering. He was creating a shrine of their life together. Every single item was a memory, a token from a moment they had shared. The mouse was her first gift to him, her first attempt to bridge the silence. The bottle cap was from the night their world had truly begun to change. The pine needle was from the door she came in and out of, the promise of her return. The hair tie was a piece of her, something that smelled like her. The sea glass was a piece of her past, something she valued, and he had, in his own way, valued it too. He wasn't retreating into the past. He was trying to make sense of the present. He was collecting the evidence of his new, fragile happiness and laying it all here. In the one place that had once been the epicenter of all his pain, he was transforming it, redeeming it. Mara's vision blurred, the tears coming hot and fast, streaming down her face without a sound. Her breath hitched in her chest, a soft, broken sound. She brought her hands to her mouth, trying to stifle the sob that was rising in her throat. It was too much. The understanding was a physical weight, a wave of such profound, aching love that it felt like it might crack her ribs. This small, silent creature. This kitten who had lost his entire world. He hadn't shut down. He hadn't turned away. He had been watching, learning, collecting. Every small kindness, every shared quiet moment, he had been gathering it all up and honoring it. He was a cartographer of their shared heart, and these were the landmarks he had chosen to remember. She looked at him. He was still sitting beside his treasures, watching her, his head tilted. His winter ocean eyes were wide, reflecting the sliver of hall light. He looked anxious, unsure. He had shown her his most vulnerable secret, the inner workings of his heart, and he was waiting for her reaction. Was it good? Did she understand? "Oh, Leo," she whispered, her voice a ragged, wet thing. "Oh, my sweet boy. Is this all for me?" She reached out a shaking hand, not to take the treasures, but to him. She held her fingers just inches from his face, an invitation, just as she had that night on the couch. He didn't hesitate. He leaned forward and pressed his face into her hand. But this time it wasn't a single fleeting head bunt. He rubbed the entire length of his body along her arm, his back arching, his tail curling into a question mark. He was pouring himself into the gesture, marking her, claiming her. His purr erupted, not the rusty, hesitant sound from before, but a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through her entire arm, up into her bones. It was the sound of a motor finally, fully turning over. It was the sound of absolute, unadulterated trust, he was telling her. "This is us, this is what we are, this is my proof." She crumpled forward, her forehead coming to rest gently on the dusty floorboards beside his treasures. She cried then, deep, shuddering sobs that she'd been holding back for months, for a year, maybe for her entire life. She cried for her failed marriage, for the lonely nights, for the empty side of the bed. She cried for this tiny kitten who had lost his brother. She cried for the sheer unbelievable beauty of being seen, of being understood by a small gray soul who collected bottle caps and pine needles as love letters. And he didn't run. He didn't get scared by the raw human emotion. He stayed. He pressed himself against her, butting his head against her wet cheek, purring his thunderous purr directly into her ear as if to say, I know, it's okay. I'm here." He was comforting her. After she had come in here worried about him, He was the one offering solace. The purity of it, the selflessness only made her cry harder. When the storm of tears finally began to subside, leaving her hollowed out and light, she lifted her head. Leo was sitting calmly now, washing a paw as if he hadn't just orchestrated the most emotionally devastating moment of her life. He was finished. He had said what he needed to say. Mara wiped her face with the back of her sleeve, her breathing still hiccuping. She looked at the little collection on the floor. Her heart felt so full it was painful. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't leave his treasures here in the dust and the dark. This wasn't a place for hiding things anymore. This was evidence of a miracle. It needed to be seen. Slowly, carefully, she gathered them up. The soft mouse, the cold bottle cap, the prickly pine needle, the twist tie, the hair tie, the brittle leaf, the smooth sea glass. She cupped them all in her hands, this priceless, fragile museum of their love. They felt warm from his presence. She stood up, her legs shaky. Leo watched her, his tail giving a slow, curious flick. She walked out of the spare room, and he followed, his purr still a quiet rumble. She didn't go to the living room. She went to the small bookshelf next to the television, the one that held a few photos and her one precious piece of good pottery. A wide, shallow bowl glazed a deep, oceanic blue. Gently, reverently, she poured his treasures into the center of the bowl. They made a soft, clinking, rustling sound as they settled. She arranged them just so, a little art installation of their shared history. She placed the bowl back on the shelf, right in the center, where the light from the lamp would catch the frosted sea glass and the bright blue of the hair tie. There. Now it was part of the home, not hidden away in a dark corner, but displayed, honored. She turned and looked down at Leo. He was sitting at her feet, looking up at the bowl, then at her. He gave one of his slow, deliberate blinks. Yes, she thought, blinking back through her fresh tears. Yes, it's perfect. She sank to the floor, sitting cross-legged, and he immediately climbed into her lap. Not beside her, not near her, in her lap. He turned around twice, kneaded her leg with his tiny needles for claws, and then settled down, a warm, purring weight in the cradle of her thighs. He tucked his nose under his tail and closed his eyes, completely and utterly at home. Mara rested her hand on his back, feeling the powerful vibration of his purr travel up her arm and straight into her heart. She looked at the bowl on the shelf, the collection glowing under the lamplight. She finally understood, completely. He hadn't been trying to show her where he'd been. He'd been trying to show her what he had, what they had built together piece by piece, moment by moment. He was a creature of the present, after all. He wasn't haunted by what was lost. He was celebrating what was found. The silence in the apartment was different now. It wasn't the silence of absence. It was the silence of contentment. It was full. It was warm. It was punctuated by the steady rhythmic rumble of a purr that said again and again, "You are mine and I am yours, and that is everything." The storm had passed. The mystery was solved. And the love that remained was so vast, so deep, it felt like it could fill every empty corner of the world. Time, after that, took on a different quality. It wasn't something to be endured, to be gritted through until better days arrived. It became something to be lived, to be collected. The deep winter settled in for real, locking the city in a silent white embrace. But inside the apartment, the world was warm and vibrant and alive. Leo's bowl of treasures remained on the shelf, a permanent exhibit. Mara found herself adding to it, but only after careful consideration. She'd place a shiny coin she found on the sidewalk heads up, a particularly beautiful red leaf she'd pressed in a book. It wasn't just his collection anymore. It was theirs, a shared ongoing story told in objects, and he approved. She'd sometimes catch him sitting on the bookshelf, not touching the bowl, just looking at it, his tail swishing slowly, contentedly, as if admiring their handiwork. He was a different cat. Or perhaps he was finally the cat he was always meant to be. Once the weight of his grief was lifted, his purr became a constant low-frequency soundtrack to Mara's life, a sound as familiar and comforting as her own heartbeat. He slept on her bed now, a warm, heavy lump pressed against the small of her back, or sometimes curled on the pillow next to her head, his soft breath tickling her ear. Mornings were no longer a groggy struggle. They were a ritual. He'd wake her with a gentle pat of his paw on her cheek. No claws, just the softest tap, tap, tap. If that didn't work, He'd resort to sniffing her eyelids, his cold, wet nose a far more effective alarm clock than any blaring radio. They'd have breakfast together, her coffee and toast, his crunchies, and a dollop of wet food. He'd sit on his designated kitchen counter spot and supervise, offering silent commentary with flicks of his tail. The world outside continued to be loud and chaotic and often unkind. Mara still had bad days at the diner. Her car still needed fixing. The loneliness of her divorce would sometimes creep back in on the edges of a quiet evening, a cold tendril of memory. But it never took root. Not anymore, because there was always a soft head to scratch, a purr to listen to, a small living creature who depended on her and, more importantly, adored her. His need for her was a tether, pulling her back from the brink of her own thoughts. His love was a light that left no room for the old shadows to grow. She started painting again. One afternoon, she dragged her easel and a blank canvas into the living room, just to feel the familiar weight of a brush in her hand. Leo had been fascinated. He'd watched, mesmerized as she mixed colors on her palette, his head tilting as the swirls of blue and white became the color of his own eyes. He never tried to knock over the water cup or bat at the brushes. He was her silent, most appreciative audience. She painted the frost on the window panes. She painted the deep blue of the winter twilight. And then one day, she turned the canvas and began to paint him. Not a perfect portrait, but the feeling of him. The soft gray blur of him napping on the couch. The intense green blue of his eyes. It was messy and impressionistic and full of love. The coordinator from the rescue organization called. "How's our little guy doing?" she'd asked, her voice cheerful. "We've got a few applications coming in that look really promising. Family's asking about him." Mara had held the phone, her eyes finding Leo where he was chasing a sunbeam on the rug. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, had seized her chest. The thought of him leaving, of this apartment without the sound of his purr, of his bowl of treasures being just a collection of junk again, it was unthinkable. He's still coming out of his shell. Mara had said, her voice tighter than she intended. "I think he needs more time. A lot more time." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Okay," the coordinator said, her tone softening as if she heard the panic Mara was trying to hide. "No rush. We just want what's best for him." When she hung up, Mara had sunk onto the couch, her hands shaking. Leo had immediately abandoned his sunbeam, leaping onto her lap and butting his head against her chin, purring as if to soothe the fear he'd undoubtedly sensed. She held him close, burying her face in his fur, which smelled like sunshine and home. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice fierce with a love that surprised her. "You're already home." The seasons began their slow, inevitable turn. The brutal cold relented minute by minute, day by day. The snowbanks lining the streets shrank, turning gray and gritty before melting away entirely, revealing the brave green shoots of crocuses pushing through the cold mud. The light changed too. The weak, thin winter sun was replaced by a stronger, golden light that poured through the windows and pooled on the floorboards, and Leo would sprawl in it, a puddle of blissed-out fur. One Saturday morning in early spring, the air through the open window held the first true promise of warmth. Mara was cleaning, something she found herself doing more often now that the apartment felt like a home worth caring for. She was changing the sheets on her bed, and Leo, as was his custom, was helping by attacking the billowing folds of the comforter as she tried to straighten it. As she pulled the fitted sheet from the mattress, something small and dark tumbled from the space between the mattress and the headboard, landing on the floor with a soft thud. Leo pounced on it immediately, batting it with his paws. "Hey, what have you got there?" Mara said, laughing. She assumed it was one of his toys, a lost crinkle ball or another hair tie he'd stolen. She knelt down and gently pried it from his playful grasp. It wasn't a toy, it was a tiny, felted wool mouse. But it wasn't the one she'd bought him, the one that now resided in the blue bowl on the shelf. This one was older, more worn, its gray fur matted in places. It had little black bead eyes, and one of them was missing. It was clearly handmade, a little lopsided, stuffed with something that felt like rice, and it smelled different. It didn't smell like her apartment or like her or like Leo. It smelled faintly of dust and time and some other unknown place. Mara sat back on her heels holding the tiny, ragged mouse. Where had it come from? She'd never seen it before in her life. This bed was second-hand, bought off an online marketplace when she'd first moved in. It must have been lodged deep in the crevice for months, maybe years, through another person's life, another person's sleep. It had been hidden there all this time. Leo was sitting before her, utterly still. He wasn't trying to get the mouse back. He was just watching her, his expression unreadable. His tail was still. His ears were pricked forward. He looked serious, and then, in a flash, she understood. This wasn't her mouse. This wasn't part of their collection. This was his. This was from before. This was the mouse he must have had with his brother Sam. In whatever life they had before the rescue, before the cardboard box, before her. This was the toy they had batted between them. This was the toy he had probably slept with, cuddled with. This was the last remaining piece of his first family. It must have been in the carrier with him when he arrived, fallen out and been kicked or swept. Lost to the darkness under the bed, forgotten by everyone except, perhaps on some deep unconscious level. Him. He had lost his brother. And then he had lost this, the last physical touchstone of that brother. He had lost everything twice over. And yet he had built a new life. He had chosen to love again. He had not brought this to his collection. This wasn't a treasure for the blue ball. This was a relic. A sacred, painful artifact of a past he had, against all odds, learned to live beyond. Mara held the tiny, one-eyed mouse in her palm, and it felt like holding a ghost. It was the heaviest thing she had ever held. She looked at Leo, and her vision swam with tears. He blinked at her slowly, a look of ancient, quiet knowledge in his sea-colored eyes. He wasn't sad. He seemed at peace. He had shown her his final secret. The first chapter of his story, she didn't know what to do. Putting it in the bowl with the other treasures felt wrong. Those were tokens of a new beginning. This was a memorial. Burying it or throwing it away felt like a desecration, so she did the only thing that felt right. She went to her sewing kit and found a spool of strong red thread. She carefully, tenderly threaded a needle and sewed a small, neat loop onto the mouse's back. Then she walked to the window in the living room, the one that looked out over the waking street. She tied the other end of the red thread to the latch so that the little mouse dangled in the air, suspended. It turned slowly in a gentle breeze that flowed through the screen, a tiny, weathered acrobat dancing in the spring light. Leo came and sat on the windowsill below it. He didn't try to bat it. He didn't try to catch it. He just watched it spin, his eyes half closed in contentment. It was a part of his history, finally acknowledged, finally given a place in the sun, not hidden away in darkness, not enshrined as an object of grief, but simply there, acknowledged, a part of the whole. Mara stood behind him, her hand resting on his back, feeling the rumble of his purr. She looked from the mouse dancing in the window to the bowl of treasures on the shelf, to the painting of him on her easel, and finally to the cat himself, solid and warm and present. This was the final gift, not the mouse itself, but the profound understanding that came with it, that love is not a finite resource, that a heart can break and heal and still have endless room to grow, that we can honor our past without being imprisoned by it, that we can lose everything and still somehow find a way to build something new, something beautiful out of the pieces that remain. Leo had taught her that. This small gray kitten had crossed an ocean of loss, not with boldness, but with a quiet, persistent courage, collecting tokens of hope along the way, and had chosen to trust her. And in doing so, he had taught her how to trust again, too. The love they had was not a replacement for what was lost. It was its own unique, powerful thing, and it was enough. It was more than enough. You stayed till the end, thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.